Well, hello, welcome to Talking With. I'm your host, Gil Mathew, the Executive Director for the Nevada County Economic Resource Council. Great to have my guest here this morning with me, Rich Peevers. And this is a podcast where we pull back the curtain on Nevada County in yesteryear and on other things as they come about. Today's podcast I've entitled Mining the Story. First, I want to read you some information about my guest, Rich Peevers. There's a lot that could be said about Rich. He has a degree in geology from Reno and an MBA from Reno, but it says the ELCO MBA program. We're going to get into that in just a minute. Rich, I consider him to be a mining engineer. He will quarrel with me on that, and we'll talk about that perhaps later also. But all of the stuff that's on your resume here, Rich, we don't really care about any of that. What we care about today is we care about how did a guy like you end up in Nevada County and not Elko, Nevada?
Well, I was in Elko for quite a while. When I was growing up, I was born in Reno, and then we moved to Chico. And my family are big skiers, so during ski season, we would drive from Chico to the ski areas, and we'd come right through Grass Valley, Nevada City. Right up Ridge Road, and then take the highway on up from there. That's about where the snow usually started, right? So my career progressed. I was a miner for a long time, working out in the weeds. Elko, Nevada could certainly be considered the weeds, right along with Winnemucca and Lovelock and Battle Mountain. And there came a time when I wanted to be more mainstream, and I had an opportunity to kind of pick where I was going to live. And Nevada City, Grass Valley came to mind, right? It turned out that I knew somebody who'd worked here for Vector Engineering, and when I dropped that individual's name with the management of Vector, it was almost an instant hire. I didn't know that at the time. It was like, wow, that was a quick turnaround in the interview, but apparently that was a good name to drop. So I went to work for Vector Engineering, and that's really how I ended up in Western Nevada County. I sort of chose it as a place that I knew between Chico and Reno, and a nice place to live.
Well, that's great because most of us chose to live here. There are very few actual natives left anymore. We've all come from somewhere else, as I've always found it fascinating that you grew up in Nevada and that you wound up in Nevada County. And I thought maybe it was just a confusion on names, and you thought this was actually Nevada. But perhaps not, huh?
Right.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's how that went.
So this MBA thing that's on your resume, it says Reno and then says Elko? Elko MBA? What? I didn't realize that.
Well, that was a pretty fascinating situation. UNR put together a telecommunications MBA in Elko that the mining company subsidized. So Newmont and Barrick got together, put a bunch of money into this, did a bunch of AV stuff. This was in the 90s, right? So this is before all the internet video stuff that we have today. So they built a lot of infrastructure, and so I got my MBA in Elko, and some of the classwork was done on video, but it turned out that the instructors came out for the long sessions. We'd have 3 days of classes, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Those were grueling, but the instructor would come out for that. There were about 25 of us in the cohort, and it was really a brilliant experience, and it was all in Elko. The only time I went to the UNR campus was to get my diploma.
Well, that answers that quizzical question I've had for a long time since I've known you for years and knew that you had this Elko MBA. So thank you for clearing that up for me. So we've talked about how you got here. I'm going to ask you an embarrassing question I'm going to ask you not to answer.
Okay.
I don't want to know anything about the mine issue in Nevada County.
All right.
But what I do want to
mine.
know is I want to know what you know about the early days of mining in Nevada County.
I know a little bit. There are people in the community that know a lot more than I do, but the history here is pretty fascinating. The mines in Nevada County were quite deep. There were many, many of them. The Miners Foundry produced these stamp mills that you can find all over the West, or you could before they were all scavenged. So the business of mining here in Nevada County was off the charts. I mean, the valley was full of the sound of ringing of these stamp mills. Many, many deep mines, 15, 20 at any given time. Quite a few smaller mines. I mean, there were mines everywhere. There's residue from those mines that exists even today. I mean, vent raises open up under people's houses and stuff, right? There were some pretty brilliant miners here. I just read a book by Gage McKinney about George Starr, who was the mining engineer for the Empire Mine. And he and Bourne, I don't remember Bourne's first name, but he was the manager, and those two did some really innovative things in terms of costs and extending the mine life and extending the mines deeper. These mines were some of the deepest in the world at the time. The only other place that had mines quite as deep was South Africa, and George Starr spent some time in South Africa. So like today, the true mining professionals move around the world. It's a global business, right? So the mining here was pretty extraordinary. And of course, the whole mother lode from here down to about Arnold, Calaveras, was really rich mining area, but the biggest mines were here.
Interesting. So a couple of things. One, you used a term, vent. I don't think anybody watching this podcast is going to know what a vent is.
So
Vents arise up underneath a house.
Right. So there's a bunch of tunneling that happens with underground mining. The mines up here tended to have declines that were really steep, so you have a shaft with a hoist, but it came up a ramp essentially, so it wasn't vertical. But you also have to have ventilation, and it's a lot easier to do what they call a vent raise. So you already have an opening underground, you can get underground, you can drill a pilot hole down to someplace underground, and then you can pull a bit up from the surface, and that's called a vent raise. And that's how you do a relatively small diameter boring for ventilation. Those sorts of things are fairly easily abandoned because if you don't mark them, you don't know where they are, but they're also very deep and very dangerous. I mean, you might find one that's got debris in it, but you don't know how much debris and you don't know how deep it is. So it could just cave away 1,000 feet at any time. Wow. Those are a bit of a hazard.
Well, this is encouraging. Nevada County, look out. Venting may be in your neighborhood, but we'll watch for that. You also talked about something else I find fascinating, and that is that miners tend to sort of rotate around the world. Rumor has it that you've been in a lot of places relative to mining. Could you name some of the more important ones?
Well, I don't want to confuse important with exotic, but I spent some time in Russia, which was pretty interesting, looking at nickel deposits. I've been to Brazil. Brazil has a lot of mining. A lot of the world's iron comes from Brazil, but there's also gold and base metals and lots of other stuff. There's a couple mines here in the U.S. I've been to some places in Arizona and in Utah. The Bingham Canyon mine is a very large copper operation, even today with some of the big South American mines. I spent a lot of my career in northern Nevada. So you may or may not know, that's the biggest gold mine in the world is out in northern Nevada. It's now called Nevada Gold Mines, which is Barrick and Newmont's combination, their joint venture. There is a lot of gold that comes out of there, and that's 5.5 hours east of here. Largest mining complex for gold in the world.
Wow.
I don't know how exotic that is, but I spent a lot of time out there.
But other things have been on your map. I think Sweden, Chile, and Australia. Are those true?
That is. I work for an Australian firm, so I don't actually get to work on Australian projects because there's people that live there that do that. Sweden has some really serious mining, and we've done quite a bit of work for a major Swedish company. And that's really interesting. Those ore bodies are really big, really successful. The Swedes know what they're doing. The beauty of that is you travel somewhere else, you learn how other people do this stuff, and you always learn. That's the beauty of being a consultant, is you're always learning, right? I really appreciate that. So the Sweden jobs have been fascinating, and we've worked for a couple companies there, and there's more of that work coming up.
Well, terrific, yeah. So you're sort of a bon vivant world traveler, wearing muddy boots most of the time, I suppose.
Yeah, well, the work I do is largely in front of a computer, so it's a dress up from the waist up kind of thing.
So some Zoom calls?
Lots of Zoom calls. Almost all my work is remote, and it has been for 15 years.
And just what is it you do?
Well, I've got degrees in geology, engineering, and finance, so that makes me a management consultant, I guess. We look pretty seriously at the technical side of the business and how it converts to money. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the money you're making. And mining is super complicated, and that is a very difficult equation. You have the geology, you have the mining part, you have the metal extraction part, and you have the sales part. And then around all of that, you've got the social and environmental part, which is huge, and getting more so every day, ESG and stuff, environmental sustainability and governance. So we cover all of that in an integrated planning cycle where we combine all of the silos together and come up with a single solution, which even today is challenging for mining companies to do because those different disciplines are also siloed. It's really hard to get the geologists talking to the mining people, talking to the processing people, talking to management, talking to the environmentalists, right? So if you get them all in the same room and model everything all together, that becomes very fascinating for all concerned. That's what we deliver.
Interesting. I've known you for many years. You've talked about some of the projects you've worked on. I've been fascinated about it. Since I'm an economist, the idea of numbers just excites me. So in the mining world, are there some secret mining stories that all of you miners know about but we don't know about? The lost gold mine of Death Valley or something like that.
There are a lot of mining stories. That's part of what makes mining so fascinating is every ore body is different. They're mined by different people at different times with different commodity prices. Some stories people know about and some people probably won't know about. One that comes to mind is one that happened in the 90s about an outfit called Bre-X. Have I told you about Bre-X?
No.
So Bre-X was a Canadian junior, and the Canadian juniors are really the groundswell of most of the mining in the world. These guys go out, they find a property, they drill it, they try to figure out how much material is there, and then they promote it, right? So this is a promoter deal, right? Most of them don't make it to the big time. One in particular did, and that's Barrick, the largest gold miner in the world. They started as a Canadian junior, right? And they had a couple deposits and they made some really good decisions and became the largest gold producer in the world. But in the 90s, there's a company called Bre-X, and they had this project in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is a little remote for most people from the West, right? It's hard to get to, and it's an interesting place, right? So they had that going for them in terms of camouflage. So they started generating these press releases talking about these ore intercepts they had. And this happened over time. This is 6, 8, 10 months, right? Where they kept having these press releases and more drilling and more gold, and the thing kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty soon they're pitching the largest gold deposit in the world, right? And everybody in the industry is paying attention. It's like, wow, we want a piece of that. So I worked for Barrick. We were interested in that. Freeport was interested in that. And we're all thinking, wow, this is cool. I remember talking with other geologists and engineers at Barrick saying, we're going to Indonesia. This is going to be the coolest thing ever, right? And it turned out that they didn't want Barrick, they wanted Freeport, right? So we sort of were taken off the list. And it wasn't very much longer after that, when Freeport was doing some due diligence, that they found some anomalies with the drill core. Right? And this is the core you pull up from a drill hole that's, very deep in the ground. That's how you know what's down there. And it turned out that this stuff had these nice little rounded grains of gold in it, which is naturally very difficult to achieve. Back in the Mark Twain days, they would call that salting the mine. And this is a very elaborate thing. There were like 300 drill holes that were very cleverly salted, so all of this would work into a nice wireframe model, and you could show this in a picture. And the alarm bell started ringing. By now, Bre-X is almost $1 billion company, and it turned into a $100,000 company in about 48 hours.
Wow.
And so widows and orphans are just lost their shirts, right? I mean, it was a huge debacle, big black eye for the mining industry because these guys got away with this. Well, I don't know if they got away with it. Somebody apparently fell out of a helicopter with a big suitcase full of money. They made a movie about this. Matthew McConaughey was in that movie. I don't remember the name of it, but that was the whole Bre-X story. That's just one of those things that, as a professional miner, I kind of lower my head and try not to think about that.
So as it all turns out, what I'm learning from all of this is that those old mining stories of salting the mine in the 1850s is still going on, or has been recently.
Yep. Be careful of what you invest in. It's still very speculative, even with all the technology and clever people we have today.
Good. Wonderful talking to you about the mining world, but there's another world to you. That's the world of Rotary and the world of service. And so we're both wearing a pin here today. which makes us somehow related, I think.
Right.
And you're a very recent president of Rotary.
I'm
How was that experience?
I'm a very recent past president of Rotary. I'd point out that you're a past president of Rotary as well.
But I was a president in the last century.
Important to quantify that. Thank you, Gil.
Yes.
The 49 Rotary Club is really a vibrant and active club. And on the one hand, it was a little stressful because I wanted to do a good job and do well by the club. On the other hand, though, I was constantly impressed with what the members do and just what the club does as a whole. Very fulfilling. Lots of projects, lots of funding, lots of work projects for like the Booth Family Center and Bright Futures for Youth, just to name a few. We have our annual duck race every year, and that is always a success. Even through the pandemic, it was a success, which actually surprised me. So I find Rotary really interesting in terms of service, but it's also fellowship. It's largely my social life now. I mean, those people are all friends. Just for information, our club's about 60 people now, 65, something like that. So I find Rotary really fascinating, interesting, and I focus more on the community piece. Rotary is an international service club, very large. The Rotary Foundation, and you might know this better than I do, but it's got to be over $1 billion, right? It's a very large foundation. So there's global work to be done. There's work right here in the community to be done.
There is, yeah. Rotary has been a great part of my world since 1986. But beyond that, you also sort of lead in a leadership capacity for the, I'm going to call it the Nevada County Engineers Club.
That's the Engineers Association of Nevada County. I recently passed the torch back over to Eric Crabb of Millennium Planning and Engineering, so he's the current president. But I also really appreciate that organization. That's an organization for kind of the developers, geoengineers in the community. Engineers don't always act as socially as they should, so it's good getting these people together and getting to talk to other human beings, right? We have some pretty incredible young people in the organization now. Many of them are people who grew up here, went off and got their degrees and came back as engineers. And I think that's really brilliant. We have presentations every month, usually on a local project. We're looking right now for candidates for our Project of the Year and Engineer of the Year awards for this year. We're thinking Loma Rica is one, Mill Street, downtown Grass Valley is another. If anybody has ideas about that, let us know. But that's been a very fun organization. We do scholarships. We do quite a few things in our own way to further the community. The scholarships for engineering students is kind of a big deal. It's about $3,000 a year.
Terrific. Well, you're very involved in the community. We're glad to have you here. We're glad that you left Elko and that you didn't actually leave Nevada. You just put it over here.
Right. So, I moved to the other Nevada, the original Nevada.
The original, that's right. It was the original Nevada. So I want to thank Rich Peevers for visiting with us here today and talking with, where we pull the curtain back on Nevada County in yesteryear and a lot of other things along the way. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next month on Talking With.